Thank you for listening to Footnotes, a Fellowship Mosaic podcast. This is a space for us to dig deeper into Scripture, what is happening in our community and culture, and continue the conversations we start on Saturday nights. We are excited to have you join us as we pursue truth, holiness, and redemption together.
Well, hi, welcome back to Footnotes. This is Nick, and we're following up to Scott Jones' sermon this previous weekend, and the conversation in that sermon centered on the idea of sin in the church and how the church handles sin. And one of the points that we saw in the text is that there's actually a couple of different paths when we're dealing with sin to think through. One is the path for the non-believer, and the other is the path for the believer. And one of the things that Paul really leads us to in 1 Corinthians 5 is that it's not the church's job to discipline the sin of non-believers. That's not our work to sit there and call the world out to discipline them. They don't know Jesus. They need the gospel. And so Paul says, when I'm giving you instructions, these are his actual words in 1 Corinthians, he said, I wrote you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the people of the world who are immoral. In that case, you'd have to leave this world. So Paul, when he's talking about this distance that we put between ourselves and people who are in sin, he is not talking about distancing ourselves from a sinful world. That's the first point to get clear. Sometimes I think as a church, we can think that our job is to put all this distance between us and the world, and we're supposed to have a witness in the world. And so Paul's really clear in saying, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm specifically talking about believers who are in sin. And so there's this in-house and outside the house division being made here, where Paul says our responsibility to hold people accountable for sin has to do with believers, people who are part of the family of God. And so what I want to talk a little bit about, Paul then, Scott did a great job laying out that there's people who are in the church who are in sin and who are repentant, who receive grace and healing and care, and then those who are rebellious, who get discipline. I want to talk a little bit about how church discipline functions at Fellowship and in Fellowship Mosaic. So we get questions about that. Do we actually practice this, and how does that happen? And a lot of times people wonder that because they don't see it visually happening. And so I want to explain a little bit about how we're structured at Fellowship and how church discipline actually takes place. And so part of the concept that we need to understand that Paul talks about is the concept of fellowship. The English fellowship comes from a Greek word that is koinonia, and it means to have things that are shared between you. There's a connection between people. So Scott did a great job laying this out in the sermon. For church discipline to be effective, there actually has to be fellowship and koinonia, because the church doesn't punish with like corporal punishment. You know, we don't beat people. We don't make people pay dollar amounts for sin. The mechanism for accountability in the church is fellowship. It's relational. And so Scott said for church discipline to matter, I thought this was such a great insight, like the fellowship has to be thick and real, so that when you lose it, you feel it. And so the question, first of all, comes down to how do we experience fellowship at our church? And because that is the boundary line for church discipline. And the first thing that's in our structure that's important to understand, our worship gatherings on the weekend, we consider public gatherings. Okay? So they're open to anyone who wants to come. Believer, non-believer, you're welcome. Wherever you are in your faith journey, you're welcome to come on for Fellowship Mosaic on Saturday nights. So for the most part, the only thing that would get you banned from joining us on Saturday night is if you showed yourself to be a threat to other people. And so if there were legal issues, if you were harassing people, if you were just deliberately, interrupting service and causing a disturbance, we might ask you to step out if you're not respecting what we're doing there. But for the most part, we want our doors to be wide open on Saturday night. And so that is not the place that we practice church discipline primarily. And so sometimes people might, look in the service and go, wow, I know that person over there sitting in worship is dealing with such and such struggle, and man, we must not practice church discipline here. But we've made the choice to make our Saturday night worship gathering open. where we experience fellowship in our model, we are a celebration model church, which means we have a public worship gathering on the weekend, and then we have small groups during the week where we experience fellowship together. That's where we process our lives. That's where we pray together. That's where we study the scriptures in groups and we hold each other accountable. So church discipline in our context takes place in the small group ministry. And so that's why oftentimes if there's a situation that you know about, you might not be aware of the discipline that's taking place because it's happening at the small group level. And that's really where we practice this accountability is if somebody were in a season of open rebellion or sin, it's really in the small group that we would be challenging them. And the other area of accountability comes in serving. And so when you serve in a ministry area, and there's different ministry areas have different lines of accountability, but it's really there that we are going to practice church discipline. The other point that I think is important to note is the difference between somebody who is repentant and someone who is in rebellion. And so Galatians chapter 6, Paul talks about this. He says in chapter 6, verse 1, "Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted." In everything we do, the aim is gentleness. We are not here to try to make a public spectacle of people who've sinned, because notice what Paul says, "But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted." Every single one of us struggles with sin. Every single one of us goes through seasons of difficulty. Every single one of us, myself certainly included, goes through seasons of rebellion where I'm just stubborn about my sin. And our goal here is not to be as heavy-handed as possible. Our goal is actually to be as gentle as possible while still holding people accountable. And so noticing somewhat as you walk through this season of heart work on another person and their sin, one of the things we want to notice is this a person repentant? Are they broken over their sin? Or are they stubbornly pushing back? I remember having a conversation with Russell Dortch several years ago. And he had to ask someone to step off the worship team because of something in their life. And I asked him, I was like, how do you make that call? How do you know, like, okay, this person is struggling and I want to keep working with them, or this person really needs to take a season? And he really gave me, 3 questions to ask that I thought were really, really helpful and have kind of continued to be a really good grid for me. The first one is, does their serving actually harm them or others because of what they're dealing with? So there's sometimes that because of the nature of the sin, their service might actually be a hindrance to the body because of what they're dealing with. The second one is, are they being stubborn and rebellious? When they are confronted with what they're doing, are they pushing back and saying, nope, I don't care what you have to say, I'm moving forward? That would be time to hit pause and have them step away. The third is, are they blind? Are they just so unaware they can't even see what's happening? And so he says, is it unhelpful? Are they rebellious? Or are they blind? Those are things that would cause us to kick into the discipline category of needing to ask them to step away. But he said, if they are broken over their sin, if they're asking for help, if they're saying, I see it and I want to grow, and them continuing to serve, continuing to evolve and be involved in community is not harmful, then we want to help someone. We want to continue to keep them around. If we kick out every struggler, there's no one left in the church. We'll have no church left. And so when we think about putting these two passages together, 1 Corinthians 5, where Paul tells us to expel the immoral believer, and Galatians 6, where Paul tells us to restore people gently, aware of our own tendency toward brokenness and sin. What we get is a picture that says we need to be firm on sin, but we also need to be gentle with people. And the goal is restoration. Our goal is not to purify the church to an extent that we just kick everyone out who doesn't line up. Actually, the goal for every struggling sinner is that they would be restored to health. And so we practice that in very personal ways. Every story has its own nuances and its own details. And so that's something that our community group leaders and our pastoral ministry staff are walking through every single situation, every case, trying to hold people to growing in their faith and their walk with Jesus. But because we want to do it with gentleness, like Paul commands, we're not posting names on a placard in the foyer of people who are under church discipline. We're not trying to make a public spectacle of them. We're trying to help people walk with Jesus, walk through their sin and back to healing. And so that's how we practice this at Fellowship, and it is something that we engage regularly in helping people be restored to sin, or restored to sin. That is not what we want to do. Helping people restored from sin to walking in holiness with God. And so if that's something you have questions about, or you want to know how we practice that in more detail, I invite you to shoot me an email, niroland@fellowshipnwa.org, because the goal here is that we as a body would be a people who exemplify Christ. We know that John says in his first letter that if anyone claims to be without sin, they're a liar. They're deceiving themselves and others. We're not going to be without sin. Every single one of us is broken. We know that. We acknowledge that. And yet we matter to God. And so we want to discover that love of Jesus that restores us to living for his glory. And that's what we're going to practice here. That's what we're going to continue to practice for the sake of making us a more holy, a more perfect picture of who Jesus is and what he wants for the world. So, hey, thanks for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll talk soon.